No plumber has ever looked at another plumber's plumbing and said, that guy knows how to plumb. And no welder has ever seen another person's welding and said anything that could even accidentally be misconstrued as a compliment. What's up, nerds? So I know there are plenty of welders out there who are terrific people. I know a few of them, but if your perspective on welding experts were limited to internet comments, you would think they were all giant insecure d***os. But you do not have to be a giant insecure d***o. I'm going to show you how you can dip your toe into working with metal without learning how to weld. Specifically, we are going to be talking about working with aluminum or aluminium, which I agree makes a lot more sense as a pronunciation considering the spellings of all the other similarly named elements. But I'm going to avoid the controversy entirely and call it by its original name, alumium. Look it up. If you're familiar with my work, you know I've done a lot of retro signage over the years for drive-ins, donut shops, other locations. And a lot of people have asked me about my techniques and the various tools that I use. So I'm going to be making a simple sign, and I'm going to show you a variety of options for you to make something similar. We'll start with cutting. Now this MDF I'm using, this is just a form for shaping the sign. I don't use one of these for every sign, but for some designs I prefer it. And this little wheel just lets me trace a 3/4 offset around the design. You'll see how this comes into play a little later. Now off the top, I'm going to be using this electric shear. I got this at Harbor Freight maybe 10 years ago. I've never upgraded it because I only really use it for quick rough cuts just to make material a little easier to handle. This cuts out a little strip like this. Different brands make something similar to this, a couple different designs. By the way, I'm going to do my best to link to each of these tools, or at least something similar, down in the video description. Now, when I first started teaching myself to do this kind of work, I way overcomplicated it in my head. I thought that you'd had to have all kinds of special tools to work with metal. I was buying tools specific to cutting metal. I was turning saw blades backwards to make long cuts. I was rubbing things with paraffin wax, all kinds of tips and tricks that I had gotten off the internet because I barely knew how to work with wood. Metal, it seemed to me like thaumaturgy. But after I'd tried everything else, eventually I landed on this guy right here. It's just a regular jigsaw with a fine-tooth blade. I probably do 90% of my cutting of sheet like this with this guy right here. Because the great thing about aluminum is that in many ways you can work on it the same way you would wood with many of the same tools. I used to use a corded Bosch jigsaw for this, and the thing for some reason would get really hot, and I'd find that I'd end up with aluminum like collecting on the blade. If you find that yours does that, just put a drop of tool oil directly on the blade and just do that every once in a while. Shouldn't be a problem anymore. Keep the edge you're cutting as close to the edge of your bench as possible, by the way. Otherwise, the blade will start to catch and it'll start to do that. Not only annoying, but also dangerous. Or better yet, pick up a piece of insulation foam like this, just much thicker, as long as it's longer than your blade. Then you can set your piece directly on top and cut right on top of it like this. That's what I did when I was working on that sign at Jimmy's. Good work. Now, I do have more to say about cutting, but let's take a second and talk about a related subject, deburring. Deburring is the act of removing the rough edges from a piece of material. There are various tools for doing it. These are specifically for doing holes. This one will do one side, this one will do both sides at the same time. This guy here is for deburring the edges of sheet material. You run it through these two wheels here, which are very sharp. I don't really like this thing very much. I never use it. In fact, I almost could not find this. You can also use files for shaping or for taking off sharp corners, but mostly for something like this, I just use a plain old sheet of 220 grit sandpaper. Now back to cutting. You can also use a bandsaw for cutting aluminum, although again, like the jigsaw, you're gonna need a fine-tooth blade. I don't have one right now, so I'm not gonna show you that. However, I do have my horizontal metal cutting bandsaw, which I mostly use for stuff like bar and tubing. Although, and I almost forgot about this, you can actually lock this in the upright position. There's a table that attaches here, and you can use this as a regular bandsaw also. Although I've never quite figured out how to use it properly without leaning against it or just fully straddling the thing. Regardless, this is probably the best thing that I have ever bought at Harbor Freight. I've gotten so much use out of this. And also I apparently have never cleaned it. I feel like Rip Taylor. Some people say you can use a hand-operated router like this. I tried this way back in the day when I first started. Tried using it with a wooden template, and I never could get it to work quite right, and it scared the crap out of me. So this I don't really recommend. However, you may have seen me use my CNC router for doing very small things. I'll link to the bit that I've used for that down in the video description. Although I've never really gotten this to work without making very, very shallow passes, I'd very much like to find a bit that would allow me to cut aluminum like this in one go. If anybody out there has any recommendations, I'd very much appreciate it. With recommended feeds and speeds, it's very important. Oh, and the alloys of aluminum that you've got it to work on. It's asking a lot, I know. For straight cuts, the most common tool in a machine shop is probably what's called the stomp shear. It's basically a great big blade that just chops the metal in half, and you literally stomp on a big pedal to do it. There are also pneumatic versions of that. There are also benchtop versions. I know Grizzly makes at least one, and there's a company called AccuCutter that makes a very nice one that I've been saving up for. AccuCutter, if you're hearing this, slide into my DMs. There is also another tool, one of which I got back when I was stuck on the metal-specific cutting tools. It's called a nibbler, and this is it here. And you can tell by its appearance that I do not use this. I wasn't even sure I still had this. I hate this tool. I hate it. Basically, it's got a little punch in here, and as you run it through the metal, it takes little nibbles, and it throws little crescent moon shaped pieces of metal everywhere, and they stick to you, and you can't get rid of them. Let's give it a try. I am not even going to dust it off. I will put a little oil in it though, because it has been sitting on a shelf for literally years. That's caked on there. Whoa, God. I like that sound though. I can't believe it works. this crap all over everything. Ow, God. Sticks to your flesh. Nope, nope. I still hate it. I still hate it. If you have an angle grinder, you can also use this, but you're going to want to get a cutting disc specifically for aluminum. Otherwise, it'll build up on the disc and you'll have a bad time. On the more budget-conscious end, you've got snips, sometimes called aviation snips. There's different kinds with different angles, but mostly you've got the straight one for making straight cuts, and you've got ones for making left or right cuts. If you've never used these, I'm sure that sounds silly, but that's exactly how they work. There's also this sort of this redneck technique I came up with a few years ago. It's where I use a plastic scoring knife, and I make several scores in a piece of aluminum, and then I stick it in a bending brake and snap it off. I've been using this technique for years. I still use it because it works, although it's incredibly tedious and I would like to stop. Seriously, AccuCutter, hit me up. Finally, for long straight cuts, you can absolutely use a table saw to cut aluminum. You will want to get a blade that is specified for non-ferrous metals. Also, if you have a saw stop, you will want to remember to put it in bypass mode. Every brake I have triggered, and I've got them all hanging up there on a wall of shame, is because I was in the middle of a job and forgot to set the bypass again when I restarted the saw. Now, it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, always wear the proper protective equipment and don't do anything that you're not comfortable with. Also, check your fence. You may want to add an extra piece of wood here that's flush with the table. This fence has just a tiny bit of a gap underneath it, and without this, the aluminum can slip underneath a little and get caught. Now I'd just like to take a moment to thank this video's sponsor, Delete Me. Your personal information, more than you think, is all over the internet, and that's thanks to data brokers. These are companies whose main purpose is to collect your personal data and sell it to other people. Not only is that just creepy, it also puts you at risk of identity theft and scams like those my own parents have been targeted with. Delete Me is your way to fight back and help keep your information private. I'm using it myself and it's super easy. All I had to do was fill out a short form, and a few days later, I received a personalized report listing data brokers who had my information and what they had. 10 pages worth. They have your contact information, past addresses, court records, the names of your relatives. But when you use Delete Me, they will automatically submit the opt-out request to remove your information from their sites, and Delete Me will continue to do so, monitoring for future occurrences. Go to joindeleteme.com/Wesley and use the coupon code Wesley. That's my name, also personal information, but you knew that anyway, and get 20% off all U.S. consumer plans. That's joindeleteme.com/Wesley with coupon code Wesley. I'm a coupon code. I've always wanted to be a coupon code. My father was a coupon code. My grandfather was a green stamp. Now, there's one more tool I want to show you. It technically falls under cutting, but it's really in preparation for bending. That's this guy right here. It's a notcher, and it's literally what it does. It cuts notches. It's actually one of my favorite tools. It does one job, and it does it very well. You can get the same effect, of course, with a pair of snips, but it takes twice the effort. Now, the purpose of this is, well, this 3/4 inch offset that I traced before, this is going to be a flange that gets bent over, but these edges are curved. You can't just plain bend them over. So you can do this. Now, I can't tell you exactly how far apart these notches should be. It's really just based on experience, but the tighter the curve, the closer together they should be. And you get all these wonderful little shark's teeth when you're done, though I've never been able to figure out a project for them. So now we can move on to bending. At the economical end, you've got seam pliers or hand seamers. They're basically just wide, flat jaw pliers used for gripping sheet metal. Some of them have marks on here for identifying different depths. These are fairly nice. I got them off Amazon. They're spring-loaded. These are a little more heavy-duty. I don't really like the grip on these. I don't find them comfortable, but they are offset, so it can make it a little bit easier on your wrist. My favorites, though, are, again, from Harbor Freight. I probably had these about 10 years. They haven't sold these in a very long time, but they're lightweight, and they're perfect for doing stuff like this. I even have a second pair that I ground down to be narrower for smaller teeth. And sometimes on wider bits like this, I'll use this guy to put a score in it, give me a little cleaner bend. Just like that. Now, unfortunately, most of the teeth on this design are too narrow even for these guys, so I just use pliers. Now, I can set it on my form, which is a, if you couldn't tell already, it's a rocket ship. And I'll be auctioning this off, by the way, so check the video description for details. And at this stage, I like to just tap down and file off any sharp points, as well as give the surface a sanding, which isn't absolutely necessary, but it helps the paint to grip. Now, at the other end of the bending spectrum is this guy right here. This is a metal bending brake. I have been wanting one of these for years. I just got this. I finally decided, screw it, just put it on the credit card. They come in all sizes and capacities. This is a 48-inch. It can handle up to 14 gauge mild steel. If you're ever shopping for one of these, by the way, read the fine print because they'll often call it like a 12 gauge capacity, but that only counts if you're using half of the available width. This thing weighs about 3/4 of a ton. I had to buy a shop crane just to put it together. And by the way, you may notice part of it missing here. I'm still degreasing parts of it as I assemble it, but normally this goes all the way across. And basically you just stick a piece of metal in here, you clamp it down, you lift this bit, and it bends it nice and straight. Some brakes have one solid piece here along the top, but this model is what is called a pan and box brake. This top section is divided up into what are called fingers that separate apart so you can make, well, pans and boxes. The gaps accommodate the sides as you bend it. I've also got this smaller version, which you saw earlier. This is 24 inches. It's a Craigslist find. It's kind of janky. The fingers are dented. Nothing really lines up right. I've tried shimming it, but it does an okay job. I may hang on to this and maybe put it on wheels so I can roll it to the end of a workbench, you know, if I'm working on some small projects. You can get a new one similar to this for between $250 to $500. There are also much lighter duty versions for even cheaper than that, but you're limited to very thin gauge material. There's also the homemade bending brake. I made this one myself many years ago. I started my business with this brake. No insecure skills at all. I didn't know how to weld yet. It clamped down on the metal using bolts, and This is my version of the pan and box capability. I don't have any plans for this. It's not a great design to begin with, but there are plenty of YouTube videos showing you how you can make your own at home. I'll link to one or two down in the video description. But before I do any more bending, I've got to figure out where my returns are going to go. The returns are the sides of the sign here, and I figured that out using a tailor's measuring tape. I just have to decide where each of my pieces is going to start and stop, where each of the overlaps is going to be, where all the pieces connect, and I create myself a diagram. And that ends up looking something like this. It's not great, I know, but gets the point across. With these done, all I have to do now is notch and bend this back flange here. That's what the back cover is going to attach to, but that pretty much looks like what I did with the face, so I'm going to do that off camera. However, before we move on to the next topic, where I will also explain these copper doodads, don't worry, I'm going to show you one more method of bending that I'm going to use for a piece here in the middle. If you saw my video on the tornado sculpture I did, you're already familiar with this guy. It is a slip roller, or slip roll, depending on who you talk to, cousin to the tubing bender, which puts curves in bar and tubing. This turns sheet metal into cylinders or cones. Like with a bending brake, they also come in different sizes and capacities. You just keep running it through, adjusting the little knobs in the back as you go, until you reach the radius that you're looking for. If you don't have a slip roll, you can do what I did for years until just recently, and just loosely bolt a piece of tubing to a 2x4 and roll it by hand. It doesn't come out as smooth, but it gets the job done. Now, let's talk about holes. A lot of people ask me what kind of drill bit it is that I use here. It's just a regular drill bit. It's a little longer than usual. It's 6 inches, helps me to get into difficult places. This bit here is just a depth stop. It keeps me from shooting farther through the material than I really need to. And it's spring-loaded, just to give a little bit of a cushion. Like most of these tools, I'll link to something similar down in the video description. Along with this, I also use a 12-inch version. This helps me get into difficult areas where the drill may not fit. They're both number 30 size, which is a little bit bigger than 1/8 of an inch, because I mostly use 1/8 inch rivets, which we'll get to in a minute. And these things, I talked about these just recently. They're called clecos. They are hole clamps. They hold material together until I'm ready to rivet. They also work well sticking them in this wooden form to hold things together. For larger holes, there are step bits. These are kind of like spinning broaches. They slowly open up a hole rather than trying to cut out a whole bunch of material at one time. The levels are typically labeled so you can stop at whatever specific size it is you want. You can also get hole punches, some of which work basically like a paper hole punch. There are also what are called knockout punches, which come in a mating pair. You drill a smaller hole, run a bolt through that, you tighten the bolt, and the two halves come together and knock out a specific hole size. I was pretty sure I owned a set, but now I'm not sure because I can't find them. Shows you how useful I found them. Again, you can use a CNC router. I've used that to make specific but oddly sized holes or oddly shaped holes. And I almost forgot about it, but there is a nibbler that I don't hate. It's a manual nibbler instead of air-powered, and I use it on occasion to create keyways for sockets or switches. I've even used it to make the odd square hole. Of course, there is the common hole saw. I will use these every once in a while in steel. Luckily, my drill press runs slow enough I can do that. Use them to make, regular holes or rounded ends to mate with pipe for welding. But generally, I don't like hole saws. They rarely run straight. Material gets jammed up in here. They're a pain to switch out. I'm sure people are going to tell me I'm buying the wrong ones or I don't know how to use them, but I am just not a fan of hole saws. When I need to make holes in light gauge aluminum like this, usually for light sockets, and I've been called crazy for this, but I use a spade bit. Now again, I only use this for thin gauge aluminum like this. I'm not actually using the flat part of the bit. I'm using the spurs on the outside, which make quick work of it. It does leave a bit of a burr, but I can remove that quickly with a sander. Even having to do that, when I have to run a long row of holes for light sockets, I can still do it a whole lot faster than somebody using a step bit or even a hole saw. The only ones I've found with these spurs, though, are Irwin brand, and Irwin has long discontinued these. They don't make them with the little spurs anymore. Unfortunately, I discovered that too late. Otherwise, I would have bought up all the current stock I can find. If anybody else knows of a good brand of spade bit that still has the spurs, let me know. But luckily, I have not had one of these wear out yet. I was going to drop the socket in there for dramatic effect, but I forgot the form was under here. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I will tell you what I use. Generally, for stuff like this, I use 040, which is 40 thousandths of an inch, which I believe is 18 gauge in aluminum. Aluminum uses a different standard than steel, but I've almost exclusively heard it referred to by its thickness. I will sometimes use 063 if I need something a little stiffer. And it comes in 4x10 sheets instead of 4x8, and sometimes comes with this vinyl on one side. This is for companies that have the capabilities of lasering this stuff, but it just peels right off. Sheet typically comes in a couple of alloys, 5052 and 6061. For the type of stuff that I'm doing here, it doesn't really matter, but the 5052 tends to be cheaper, so that's what I order. And people ask me where I get this. I get it at a local metal supplier. Here in Dallas, I recommend Metals for You. I've been working with them for years. Just go on Google Maps and search for a local place. But when you're getting prices, call around. There's another place here I use occasionally for harder to find stuff. But for anything else, they tend to be twice as expensive. Of course, there's also the other aluminum stock. You've got round tubing, you've got rod, you've got square tubing, angle, bar, channel, which I don't seem to have. And all of these, again, these come in different alloys, and the different alloys have different hardnesses. You know, they have different properties regarding machinability and weldability. I used a lot of this bar for the tornado sculpture. I also use some square tubing and angle when I need to make something structural for a sign. But I haven't actually learned to weld aluminum yet. That is on my to-do list. So I just, you know, I generally use screws and bolts. Which brings us to our next topic, fasteners. This right here is what started me on my current career path. This is what really got me into making things. This was many years ago, and I was obsessed with, and still am, vintage signage. In fact, you can follow a link down below. You can see a lot of the stuff that I have pulled over to photograph over the years. But I wanted to try making a sign of my own. Again, understand this was a long time ago. I barely knew how to work with wood. Metal seemed like a complete mystery. Welding seemed like something that with an average person like me had no access to. I was going to need really expensive equipment and special training. But then I discovered the existence of the blind rivet, otherwise known as a pop rivet. Pop because it's popular. Basically, it's a tube of metal with a shoulder on one end, and there's a mandrel running through it with a ball on the other end. You pull on that mandrel, and it widens the tube, fixing it in the hole, and then the mandrel breaks off. And when I found out about these, suddenly the sign seemed doable. So I picked up myself some 040 aluminum, got myself a rivet puller, and I made my first sign, a big red arrow. Eventually, I picked myself up a pneumatic rivet gun, which made things go a lot faster. Plus, I think rivets give it that classic old school look. The body of the rivets I'm using here is aluminum. They come in different metals. They also come in different widths and lengths for different thicknesses of material, as do solid rivets. This is the other main type of rivet that I use. I use these in spots where both sides of the rivet will be visible. To set these, I'm using a rivet squeezer, which does exactly what it sounds like. I got this one at a local surplus place, but you can get them at various outlets online. This is called the yoke. You can get them at different depths. And in here go dies for different types of rivets. This has a domed side and a flat side to work with these. Of course, you also have your typical machine screws and bolts, but I usually reserve this sort of thing for the type of framing that I mentioned before. It comes in especially handy if you've got to break things down for shipping. Of course, if you are using different metals along with aluminum, you have to be aware of something called galvanic corrosion, which can be a problem, especially outdoors, although I typically don't worry about it unless it's something that might be a safety issue. Aluminum is also easy to tap threads in, but if the situation calls for it, I might use something called a rivet nut, or what some people refer to as a riv nut, a portmanteau I don't really see much use for. I mean, you're only saving one syllable. My rivet puller comes with attachments for installing them. Basically, you thread one on the end of the attachment, pull it, it expands, and then you've got yourself a full machine thread in what would otherwise be too thin for tapping. There's also a technique that gets you as close to welding aluminum as you can without actually welding. It's called brazing. It can be pretty tricky to do. This stuff specifically is called AlumiWeld rod. I've only got the one short piece of it, so I may not pull this off. I find it works better with thicker material, at least 1/8 of an inch like this, because you've got to get it pretty hot for it to work. Thinner sheet just ends up melting. You got to make sure you clean off the oxidized layer from the aluminum right before you try this. A stainless steel brush works for this. And you just keep heating it up and running the rod across the joint until the metal melts the rod. There it goes. Wow, that actually worked. Of course, there are also adhesives like JB Weld, a substance I have apparently not used since April of 2019. There is also one of my favorite products. I use this stuff all the time. It's called Thixo. It's a 2-part epoxy in a tube, and Total Boat says it will work on aluminum. I do recommend that you follow their recommendations though and get yourself a really good caulk gun that has at least an 8-to-1 ratio. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but just look for that. Oh, and you can get a discount on this and other Total Boat products at the link down in the description. Finally, and the last thing we're gonna use today, self-tapping screws. There's 2 types that I keep around. Type F, which is a thread cutting screw. I find these work better for thicker materials like square tubing with an 1/8-inch wall. And then there's the Type B thread forming screw. You can find out more information about both of these over on McMaster Carr's website, by the way. I find these work better when connecting sheet metal to sheet metal, like installing a back panel on this thing. Don't forget, this guy is up for auction. It's live now, link below. I hope I gave you guys some ideas for how you might be able to build something yourself. Of course, this was not a complete list of techniques. There's always another way of doing something. So if you'd like to add to the discussion, or if you have any questions, just leave it down in the comments. Also, if you'd like to get access to some behind the scenes content and help keep me making videos like this one, there's a Patreon link down there too. It's a great group of makers over there. All right. Thanks for following along. See you, nerds.